Hi, Sarah. Welcome to Umbraco Community Day.
Hello, I think I was muted there. Sorry. I think
You're on
I've
mute.
unmuted myself now. I
There
think
we
I'm
go.
good. I'm going to say I'll give. Oh, well, I don't know if Lars used this excuse. I'm like, it's in Australia. It's 8 o'clock at night, so it's not even that late. I can't complain.
That's fine. That's one of the common mistakes that everyone makes these days. But it is a pleasure to welcome you. And I think it's your first time in the Umbraco community as well. So we are excited
It
to have you here.
is. It is, and thank you for having me. No, it is my first time, and it's always fun to. Well, it's nice to go to events and communities you've talked to before, but it's always nice to meet new ones. And well, because I talk about security, it is relevant to everybody. So whether you like it or not, so we've
Yeah.
always got things to talk about, whoever I go chat to.
It's definitely the topic that people kind of dread having the conversations about, right? But it's absolutely essential. So
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to show us.
Yeah, well, I know I've only got half an hour and I could talk about this for days, so I'll crack on. I'm sure I'll probably give people more questions than answers. I'll try to not do that, but if it gets you thinking about security, then that's awesome because, of course, it's such an important topic, and you know, you can't get away from it in your personal life, your mum, your dad, your grandma. I mean, we're not talking about that kind of security today, but you can't ignore it as much as you might want to.
We have a very active chat here, so people in the chat, please let us know if you have questions for
Yeah.
Sarah, or share your stories like you have been with Lars already,
Yes.
and we'll have a chat with you at the end, Sarah, after your session, and maybe we can do a bit of Q&A.
Yeah. Please ask questions. Please tell us, confess if you want to. Confess your security sins. I will have heard worse. I can guarantee you. I don't know if people can post anonymously. Maybe they won't want to do that. But like, everyone does silly security things. So, I've probably heard it before. So yeah.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
when you're ready, take it away.
Cool. Well, let me crack on. Let's boot up my screen, give it a share. Let me swap that round so I'm sure the studio people can actually see it. Just give me a second. And it's just gone way past. Don't you just love a bit of PowerPoint joy in the evening? There we go. Okay, we'll go back to my agenda. So, hello, everyone. So I'm going to kill you a bit with PowerPoint just because I couldn't possibly demo all the fun things. That's probably for another time. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is application security essentials in Azure. Now, disclaimer, as we've already said, I work for Microsoft, so of course I'm going to talk about what we've got in Azure land, but it is worth calling out here that, and I will talk about this as I go, that there are, the basic principles are the same, no matter what cloud you're building in. So high-level security principles are the same. Sometimes the tools will differ. There are always usually similar tools where the Microsoft Azure tools can be used in other clouds as well. I'll call that out. But if it's something that doesn't work in whatever you're building on, there will be another tool out there. And I think that's really important to mention because just because if you're sitting there thinking, oh, well, I don't use Azure and Microsoft, so this isn't relevant to me. It is. You should go find a tool that does the same thing in whatever environment you use, because security, yeah, is for everybody. Real quick, just because I like to do. So I'm just going to quickly tell you who I am. I'm going to talk about why you should care about security. As I said before, I said whether you like it or not, you need to, but I want to give you some stats and show you a little bit of the lay of the land about why it's so important. And then I'm going to talk about some really quick security wins. And this isn't a super long session, so I want to sort of get straight into the things you can go and do. Now, some of them might not be necessarily just your job. They may also be something you need to do with your security team, or if you have a DevSecOps team or a SRE team, they may be involved in this too. But it's the kind of stuff that maybe you should be going and asking about. And then, well, there's Q&A time at the end, which I put in. Really quick, who am I? I'm a cloud security advocate at Microsoft. I live in Melbourne, so I'm actually I've lived in quite a few countries now. I'm originally from the UK. I've worked in security for like 10 years. I love talking about securing things. I've written some MS Press books on security. I co-host a security podcast, which amazingly people listen to. I've been doing it for 2 years and it still blows my mind that people listen to it, because we just kind of started as a pet thing. I am a crazy dog woman. I have they are my dogs. That's actually a new picture from this afternoon. That's what I do when I update my slides. I update pictures of my dogs as opposed to maybe looking at my content. I have booted my dogs out of the office for this session because they are really good at knowing when I'm trying to do presentations and making noise. So yeah, that is me. But let's get down to it. Why should you care about security? If you're a dev and you're building, you're not securing, why should you care? So let's just put some things into context, because this is one of my favorite slides in the world. I'm just going to put the whole thing up on the screen so people can read it as I talk. But let's have a look at this. These stats come from Microsoft security research. We have quite a few security research teams, and it's in US dollars, these prices. So just to sort of tell you how easy it is to do and buy attacks. Like, you don't need to be very skilled. If you go on the dark web and some other dodgy things, you can pay about $66 to buy a ransomware program, and then you can go do your own ransomware. Then the weirdest, it's a really strange thing to say, but you can basically go on the dark web and people have like productized ransomware. So you essentially can go and do ransomware as a service. So you will pay someone to go and ransomware a company or an individual, whatever. And then when that person or organization pays out, they will clip the ticket and take 30% of the profit. It blows my mind. Spear phishing, which is more targeted phishing, you can pay people to go and do that. They will go do reconnaissance on like LinkedIn and social media, and then craft much more specific emails. So we're not talking about the old school spam of like a Nigerian prince who needs to put $1 million in your bank account. Like, it's quite specific. And I used to work for a bank, and we saw some of these emails. They were very smart. They were using very contextual information, and they would trick people into sending money and all kinds of things. As I'm sure you know, compromised account dumps go online. And if you, if we were in the room, I would ask this question, but I would say, who here is willing to admit they use the same username and password? Obviously, we can't do the virtual. Well, you can virtually raise your hand, I think, on Teams if you want to. But if you use the same username or email and password combination anywhere and it gets compromised, then, you know, they can use it in other places as well. So we shouldn't be doing that. But those compromised accounts are incredibly cheap to buy. And I don't know if you've seen recently, I mean, this one's horrible. It happened to my parents. And I've had the email too. I laughed at it. They're using those details to send emails to people saying, hey, I've got your username and I know that your password is blah, which has come from these dumps. And they're saying, and I used it to hack into your account and look at your webcam, and I know that you've been looking at naughty things on the internet and you better pay me some money, otherwise I'm going to send things to your family. It's awful. Now, I know it's rubbish, but, you know, genuinely it scares people and people pay. Anyway, as you can see, DDoS, it's about $100 a day. To get compromised devices to do Bitcoin mining or whatever, it's, you know, $1 to a couple of dollars. And then finally, 0 days. If anyone's not familiar with the phrase 0 day, that is a vulnerability that hasn't been patched. So it has no patch yet. It's just been discovered. Now, you'll notice that 0 days are very, very expensive compared to the rest of the things on here. And that's because 0 days are actually really expensive to develop. You actually need a lot of expertise, a lot of skill, and a lot of time to research these very new, unique vulnerabilities. So it's not that you shouldn't be scared of them, but in perspective, you will see them less than all of these other things. You know, I know that one of my friends works for one of the cyber emergency response teams in this part of the world, and she was telling me one of the calls they get the most, this is a government agency that anybody can ring, one of the calls they get the most is from teenagers who are DDoSing each other on like Fortnite and stuff, because there are services where you could go pay $1 or $2 to DDoS your competitor in online gaming. So if it's that accessible to teenagers, like imagine how accessible it is to like criminals, adults, people who want to do bad things. So that's just sort of the lay of the land a little bit. But the other thing, but there's good news, because I realize that sounds quite depressing. There's good news in all of this, which is, and it's boring, but good hygiene and good practices, good security hygiene. So by good security hygiene, we mean things like keeping things patched, having multi-factor authentication, good coding practices. Kind of, it's not particularly sexy or exciting. All the research shows that doing all of those good practices, and I know that some of them are harder than others to actually do in real life, that gets rid of something like 98% of attacks, because most breaches come from poor security hygiene. So it's not that you need the biggest, shiniest, nicest thing. Like if you're not patching, it doesn't matter if you've got a really shiny firewall or malware thing or whatever. You know, so this hygiene is so incredibly important. And like I said, I realize that hygiene is a broad piece that usually spans the responsibilities of several different teams, depending on what part of security hygiene we're talking about. But this is why it's really important to not be sloppy with this stuff, because this actually affords the best, like the most effective and most wide-ranging protection, as not cool as it is. And just one more stat for you before we actually talk about some things that you can do. Microsoft actually every year creates a report called the Digital Defense Report. We usually release it late in the calendar year. So we released the new one for 2022 a couple of months ago. I'll put a link at the end. It's basically our report about the state of cyber in the world, what all our research teams are seeing, etc. It's a really interesting read. It's not about products. It's just about what our research teams see, what our response teams, because we have a cyber response team as well that we can go out and help customers if they get owned. But this is the kind of, for our ransomware engagements, which is one of the most common attacks we see. These are the kind of the problems that we see. So you can see people moving laterally through not having enough privilege access management. So basically people having too many permissions. Because of course, if you've got a load of accounts as global admin or God mode, the more of those you have, if one of those is breached, then they've got loads of access. And then even if an attacker breaches an account they don't really want, or they get to a machine or an endpoint or an application they don't need, if they manage to get accounts with high privilege access, that allows them to move laterally. So you can see that one's like 93% of what we see. You know, some of the other ones, modern security frameworks, again, sort of more process thing, insecure configuration of identity providers. So again, that doesn't have to be Azure AD, that's whatever directory service you're using. It not being configured properly and to best practice. No MFA. You know, hopefully insufficient application security practices. You know, you can see that there's nothing here is like, oh my God, they didn't have a super brand new shiny tool. This is, they just didn't configure things well according to our fairly well established best practices. So it is really, really important. But, you know, you folks are building things, right? You know, you folks are building things. So you're like, okay, Sarah, that's cool, but I don't work in security, so why the hell do I care? Isn't this the security team's job? And I'd say yes and no. I think we're going through a bit of a shift at the moment. So, you know, pretty much everyone is trying to do agile, shift left, and we've got a bit of a conundrum because For me, as a security person, traditionally, we have always been like, no, we need to check everything. We're not going to let you devs do anything without us checking it. And you aren't allowed to do anything. Whereas now with DevSecOps and shifting left, essentially, we're trying to give a bit more freedom to devs, but within like guardrails. Now, honestly, this isn't a technical challenge so much as a psychological challenge, in my opinion, as in people who are building need to step up a bit and be a bit more conscious of security. And security needs to let go and trust devs and building people, operational people, to do security right. So it's an interesting chicken and egg, who goes first. I think it's still relatively new, and it's something that all organizations are on a journey to do. So one of the things I just try and do, I've actually spent a lot more time in developer communities recently, because I know that devs and developer communities find security really interesting, but it's still something that is not top of your list because you're trying to build things, you're trying to push code and blah, blah, blah. And although there is a lot of interest in it. So that's why I'm just trying to keep talking. I think that, and as IT people, we're not the best at this. We need to, devs, people who are building and security folks really need to talk more, work more closely together, because this whole agile thing, way of working, doesn't work properly if we don't. But it's a journey for everybody. But what I'm going to talk to you about is some of the things that either yourselves, depending on the size and structure of your organization, or you can go and talk to your security teams about doing these things. So let's hit it. So again, I'll reiterate just before I go, I'm going to talk kind of about Azure things, but again, as I said, if you're not using Azure, or you're using another third-party tool, say instead of Azure AD, you're using Okta, essentially the same principles apply. So, store your user identities in Azure AD. If you're building something, it should not have a separate identity store. Do not do that. That is a very bad idea. It will not be as secure. It means there's a separate username and password store that needs to be managed. You can't apply, it's harder to apply lots of good identity controls to multiple identity stores. Particularly with Azure AD, we may remember, if you're used to on-prem AD, it didn't used to play nice with a lot of things. It would only talk in proprietary protocols and blah, blah, blah. Azure AD is totally different. Although it's called AD, under the hood, it's completely different. It uses all open source, like industry standard authentication protocols. So there's no reason you shouldn't be able to talk to it. And again, if you're using some other identity provider, same principle. Like, don't be making strange little identity stores because you think it's too hard to integrate to your central identity store, whatever it is. They really have changed if you haven't looked at them. And when I've talked to dev people, this one seems to come up a lot. Make sure, of course, configure it properly, that they only get redirected to the application after they've been authenticated, not before. That can happen sometimes, depending on how you do it. In Azure AD, we have something called conditional access. Again, other identity products have some similar things. I don't know the names of them. And essentially, it's just smart. It looks at the conditions of login. So it might look at the time, the date, what you're trying to access, where you're logging in from, and it rates it as like high, medium, low risk. And then you can define, like, if it's high risk, do you want to block them? Do you want to make them re-authenticate with MFA? You can do different things. We use all this stuff in Microsoft land. When I was on holiday pre-COVID in Nepal, I obviously got flagged as a high-risk login because I don't often log in from Nepal, and I had to re-authenticate myself with MFA, etc., which I don't have to do all the time for low-risk logins. I already called it out earlier in the stats, but please use MFA. Again, doesn't matter what identity product you're using, use MFA. Everyone should be using it. I know, there's just no excuse. And all of our research shows, and you can see this, not just Microsoft research, that using MFA protects against an insane amount of attacks, insane amount of attacks it will get rid of by just having MFA. Also, if you have on-prem, there are actually ways now to use these modern identity features on-prem. In Azure AD, it's called Azure AD Application Proxy. So if you've got something old and antiquated that you can't get rid of, or you can't move it for some reason, you can actually plug Azure AD into it and get all the cool new features that on-prem AD could never do. So that's something to bear in mind. Other than that, the key vault is the store in Azure. But again, there are other secrets and key stores out there. Make sure all your certificates and keys and other secrets are in there. Also, don't use strings when you could be using something like a managed identity. A string is very basic. It's essentially just a password. You can actually use Azure. So you don't want, what I mean is you shouldn't be using a string to access a key vault. We have much nicer ways of doing that are far more secure. It is best practice, but unless you're like focusing on security, you may have missed that. That's certainly another one that comes up a lot. And finally, your client secrets and certificates, please do not give them like 200 years or 100 years. I see it all the time. I get it, because you don't want them to expire, because then you have to rotate them and it's a pain, but they shouldn't be going on forever. It's really bad practice. Again, check with your security people if you have some kind of policy on that. You may well have a policy that says, certificates and secrets can only be blah. So yeah, that's my identity thing. A couple of things around connectivity. This is quite Azure specific, this one, but again, have a look. If you're not in Azure, there are other ways. There are certainly other things out there that are similar. We have something called Azure Bastion that is, so I don't call it, Bastion is more a phrase, I think, from America. I call it a jump box or a jump host. It's basically a fully managed jump host or Bastion that you can use to get into Azure from the outside. And you can RDP and SSH into it and then jump into virtual machines on the Azure portal. Much nicer and tidier than having to have your own random rubbish jump box that you probably forget about. We also have in Azure a tool called API management, which allows you to cache and throttle and authenticate APIs. You can also limit the people who can actually access that API. Again, API management does other things as well, but just highlighting the security features, it's definitely worth having a look at. And of course, we have load balancers as well. Not officially a security tool, but I think, of course, a load balancer is useful for your availability, and availability is an important part of security. And load balancers can also, have a role in protecting against DDoS things as well. Real quick, not going to go into this because I've already talked far too much, but I assume I'm sure I can post these slides somewhere if people are interested. This is just a really nice layout of the various different bits of Azure for networking. I'm not going to talk about them. I'm not going to talk about them this time, but you can see how if you're building an application, so the three on the left are the ones you want to care about, which is DDoS, a WAF, and firewall, which should come as a surprise to nobody. And then we have network security groups and service endpoints, but that's more about just segmenting up your tenancy. So yeah, that's again just a real quick thing there. Of course, you should be encrypting things. I will again, won't go into it, but as you would expect at all different layers, you should be encrypting. Depending on what it is you're using, it will vary on whether your cloud provider is doing it or whether you should be doing it. It can change from product to product. Do make sure you have a look and make sure you're clear always on shared responsibility. Again, every cloud provider will talk to you about this. Shared responsibility, it's so important to be clear on who does what in your security controls, because if you think your cloud provider is doing it, but they're not, then there's going to be a gap. And it does happen more often than I would like to see. I definitely think we're getting better, but of course we have ways, and again there are also third-party ways of doing it. At pretty much every single layer in the OSI stack, we do encryption, as you would expect. Now, definitely sort of towards the bottom of this stack, that's always going to be your cloud provider, and then depending on what's on top, if it's a virtual machine that you're running, if it's IaaS, infrastructure as a service, you'll be needing to do it. But if it's going up more to a PaaS platform as a service, then we'll probably do it. And again, that talking about that is probably another session in itself, but all I'll say is we have ways of doing it. Just make sure you're clear on who's doing what. Also, something that's worth calling out here, I know that traditionally encrypting things like end-to-end, particularly in the, all the way through your stack, used to like really give you a hit on performance. And that's why, sometimes we used to stay away from it. That's really not the case anymore, because the power, the cloud computing power has virtually made that negligible. Unless you have an incredibly sensitive application, you will not see problems from encrypting like end to end. Like, you really won't. And I know that used to be a problem in the past, so please don't use that, or at least go do some testing, because the majority of applications will nowadays just be fine. I know that wasn't the case in the past, so something to bear in mind. Not something, moving into logging and monitoring. Now, if you're building things, you won't be doing the monitoring. That's probably going to be an operations team. But if you're building something, it's important to make sure you have your logging turned on. And if you're building something from scratch, make sure you're actually creating logs and putting them somewhere. We really recommend that logs go into a central store. Don't just shove them in a random bucket or blob storage account somewhere, because that your security or operations team don't know about, because then they can't use it. And I found, I've been working in cloud for quite a long time now. Before Microsoft, I used to do work with other clouds, and I always found this problem, is that people would not know what to do with stuff when they were building in the cloud, because no one had really thought about it. So it would just go off into the ether, or a team would just be like, oh, I'll just shove it in this bucket and leave it and forget about it. And then it was never looked at. And I'm a big fan of a phrase that's called collection is not detection. So just because you're collecting a log, if you're not running any kind of detections across it, it's not doing anything. So, that's really important. Again, you're probably not going to be doing that monitoring. That would be an operations team, but help enable them to go and do that monitoring by getting the logs somewhere and making sure the logs are actually created. And then probably in Microsoft, we have a product called Azure Sentinel. Sentinel is a SIEM, so a security information and event management tool. There are other SIEMs out there. And the idea of a SIEM, of course, is it looks through logs, it runs detections across all those logs to look for interesting behavior. In fact, I'll put this up on the next screen. It's got, here are some of the key scenarios. As a minimum, we recommend monitoring for. Of course, there will be more. It's actually a really difficult thing to give like a prescriptive list of things you should monitor for, because it's very, very contextual. Again, if you're building things, probably not so much your concern, but getting those logs somewhere where your security team can do something with them, I think that is something you can help with. Another thing, another thing that's really important is posture management. Now, posture management I freaking love, because I used to do infrastructure before cloud was a thing, and I wish posture management tooling had existed then. So CSPM is Cloud Security Posture Management. So essentially what CSPM is it looks at your infrastructure, your platform as a service. It can look at lots of different things. It depends on the tool. And it will tell you where you don't have good security configurations. So it will tell you, if you don't have MFA configured, it will tell you that. And then it will say, you should do this, dummy, because this could be exploited. It may say, hey, dummy, you need to patch this VM, all kinds of things like that. The Microsoft version of this is called Defender for Cloud. It was previously known as Azure Security Center. You may know that Microsoft likes to change our product names. And just to give you an idea, this is like all the kind of stuff that it will actually cover. So obviously it covers pretty much everything in Azure. But it also can look at AWS and GCP and on-prem. So the idea is you can get an idea of what your security posture is like across everything. Because of course, there's no point if you use, say, Azure AWS and you've got some on-prem, if this is just looking at Azure, that's not going to give you like a realistic, overview of where you're at. So it's really important that we look at everything. And so I really don't want anyone to forget about on-premise, because, on-premise isn't going away for the majority of us. Unless you happen to work for an organization that's lucky enough to have been born in cloud, the majority of us aren't getting rid of on-prem anytime soon. So I love Defender for Cloud. You can go and play around with the basic version for free in Azure. So if you're using Azure, do. It will literally give you a big long list of everything that is not configured to best practice. You don't have to go and manually look for it, because one of the things about this security posture is that it's just a pain. You can't do it automatic. You can't do it manually anymore. The way the cloud works, the ease we spin things up with, it's just not doable. So go and have a look at Defender for Cloud. It is a really nice little tool. And then last but not least, I was going to talk about DevSecOps, and I'm going to go quick because obviously I've talked too much. We have just recently released, so it's new, it's still in preview, something called Defender for DevOps, and it actually helps you do your DevOps security and secure your pipeline. Definitely go and have a look at it. But the idea is that it will help you secure your DevOps, your infrastructure as a code. It also links in really nicely with GitHub Advanced Security and Azure DevOps if you're using that. But the idea is that it's actually going to actually protect that DevOps pipeline and your application. So as I said, I know I'm running out of time, so I won't go into it, but it's very cool. You can use it across all kinds of different, you can use it, it's still a little bit limited because it's in preview, so it doesn't cover every single code repo yet, but that will change in the future. As I said, we're looking for people to go and try it and tell us things about it. So go have a look at Defender for DevOps. It fits into Defender for Cloud. Well, everything. You probably know everything Microsoft Security is called Defender for something. So go and have a look at it, try it out. Again, there are plenty of other pipeline tools out there as well, but don't forget that using a pipeline is an amazing way to inject bad things into your environment accidentally. So do make sure you are putting security controls across it. It's not just about having a look after it's been built. There have been many stories about this being a problem. So in conclusion, couple of, well, they were all go-dos, but here's some if you're interested in this kind of stuff, go read the Microsoft Digital Defense Report. It is super interesting / terrifying. We have a developer's guide to Azure. I'm saying especially read chapter 6 because that's the security one. We have something called the Cloud Adoption Security Review Tool. It's totally free. If you're doing Azure stuff, it's worth going and doing the assessment. And Defender for DevOps, like I said, it's in public preview, so go try it out. You can also send us, that's actually the feedback form, not the preview link. I've just realized that, but go download it, just search it, and you can also give us some feedback because we like feedback on things. And I'm going to take a breath because I know I have gone over time, so apologies. Thank you very much for listening. I don't know if we have time for questions because I went over a little bit, but if we don't, please tweet me or Mastodon me and I will happily answer them for you if I can.
Hey, Sarah, that was a fantastic talk. And I think we had a perfect continuation from where Lars left about how responsible we should be. Security, as we know, evergreen topic, can never go out of fashion. It was really fantastic having you speak and give us a very good overview of how Azure can empower us as developers to take care of security.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, there's just so many tools now. Again, there's so many tools because security used to be really hard because so much stuff would be manual and you'd be pulling spreadsheets and blah, 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 and no one wanted to do it. Whereas now there are so many tools that can speed up, not everything, but so many things can be automated to make it more manageable and easier. And so I really encourage people to go and find out what's out there because security's never going away. It's a hot topic. There are breaches all day, every day. Only a fraction of them make the mainstream media, like, because obviously most companies want to try and keep them under wraps if they can. I know that might change with some forced disclosure legislation in different jurisdictions, which will be really interesting. But that's where we're at. So
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Really important topic, and clearly something that people should know. So thank you so much for sharing. I just very quickly before you leave us, Sarah, I wanted to ask you about another really important topic, which is your Shibas, because I can see from looking at the background you're a big fan, and I saw a post on Twitter today. You took them punting, little hats and everything.
I did.
Can you tell us about that? It
I
looks
did
adorable.
indeed. Yeah, actually, it was the punting that provided the hats.
Oh,
They weren't
really?
very impressed with me, I have to
Oh.
say. They're currently outside my door, wondering why I've locked them out. It's because, well, they know how to play up in the background, and it is amusing. But I just decided I was not tonight.
Fair enough. Well, we'll let you go and join them. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us. And we're going to go now to our next speaker.
Thanks, everyone.